The Shoemaker's Horror. Once upon a time, there lived a shoemaker who made decent shoes for everyone in the village he lived in. He wasn't the richest, but he wasn't the poorest either. He had a decent life. One day a thin and tall man named Pinocchio pulled up beside his shack and began to sell shoes. These shoes were very tattered, but he hid the tattiness by sewing up the outside so that they were a mess of colored thread. The customers that arrived the very next day thought the colors were for decoration and happily bought the shoes for a very high price. This cheaty business was doing very good for Pinocchio. He had only one problem. Every time he lied, his nose grew longer, so he always tried to hide his nose in the flower he was always holding. People came and went, and they always bought from Pinocchio because of the marvelous shoes he sold. While he was selling shoes by the minute, the shoemaker was slowly becoming bankrupt. He did not know what to do because his wife, which he called Sleeping Beauty, was snoozing all the time, so she was no use, as she only woke up for lunch and dinner, then she was back to bed. One day he was only able to buy enough leather for one shoe. By the time he arrived back from the local store, he began to get tired, so he left the leather on the table in the middle of his workroom and went to bed. The next day, he found a nicely made pair of shoes sitting on the same table he put the leather on the night before. He scratched his head with wonder before placing them on the table in front of his shack, ready of selling. Seconds after he placed them on the table, someone came and offered an extremely high price for them. He happily accepted the offer and the deal was made. The buyer paid and took the shoes. Later that night, the shoemaker could afford enough leather for 2 shoes and a small quantity of bread. Again, he left the leather on the table in his workroom, and the next day he found 2 shoes ready-made for selling again. This time he was really curious. After selling these shoes, he bought more leather, laid them on the table and crept upstairs. From there, he watched them through the crack in the floor. Everything was quiet. The only sound that was made was the tick-tick-ticking of the clock on the wall near him. Suddenly, he heard the patter of footsteps and saw his Sleeping Beauty working away at the leather. He saw her sew away at the leather non-stop until he grew sleepy. He then fell asleep on the floor. He woke up the next morning facing some newly sewed shoes. He trotted up the stairs to say good morning to his wife. He found her sleeping peacefully in her bed. "Good morning, honey," he whispered. "Zzzzzzz," was his answer. He once again loaded his shack and waited for customers to buy the shoes. By now, Pinocchio's business was becoming less and less popular, and his customers were starting to ask him why fewer people were there. He of course couldn't tell them that the shoes were rubbish, so he made up lies. Of course, every time he said a lie, his nose grew longer, so his flower became useful. That is, until the day it burst. Suddenly, news reporters were bombarding him with questions, and while he was answering them, his nose grew longer and longer and longer until it was the size of a school bus. At this point, Pinocchio was becoming jealous of the shoemaker. The very next day, he set off for another village to sell his broken shoes to. After he left, life turned back to normal, but there was still one thing that didn't change. Every day, the shoes were still being made for him. He finally decided to confront this mystery person. Later that night, he waited again for somebody to make his shoes. He finally heard the familiar pattering of feet that he heard the other night. He saw his Sleeping Beauty creep into his workroom. He took a deep breath and started to creep down the stairs. "Honey," he whispered. His Sleeping Beauty turned around and shrieked, but settled slowly when she saw it was only her husband. For the rest of the night, they just chilled. In the morning they were dozing peacefully with the shoes half made. Suddenly, the shoemaker woke up. Realizing that the shoes were not made, he quickly whipped up a pair to sell just in time for the first of his customers to whip round the bend. From that point forth, the shoemaker continued to make shoes, and life returned to normal, completely.